Could it be that one of the things which drives us, which is underlying so much of what we do, is a search for meaning? That in all the things that we pursue in life, whether wealth or admiration, whether to raise a family or to achieve some kind of success, some kind of accomplishment, or whether in the seeking of pleasure and excitement and other varieties of experience, could it be that what we are actually seeking is something which will fulfill our hunger for meaning? And could it also be that many of the problems that we face in life, both personally as well as a collective, might be due to this absence of meaning? Could it be that so much of what we're seeing and experiencing in recent times, with the rise in anxiety and depression and suicide, drug addiction and overdoses, along with all of the violence and agitation, all of the hatred and hostility, division and conflict and so on, that all of this is in some way symptomatic of a lack of meaning? Because so many people find their lives to be without meaning, to be without purpose, to be empty and unfulfilling. And from that emptiness, we go in search of something to fulfill us, but instead, because perhaps we're not looking in the right way, what we find instead is greater disappointment and despair. And from that despair, we become either depressed and apathetic, or we become agitated and frustrated, restless and volatile. There are so many people these days who feel as if their life is devoid of meaning. They just go about their daily routine without any sense of purpose other than to survive. Ellen Goodman summed it up like this. She said, "Normal is getting dressed in clothes that you buy for work and driving through traffic in a car that you're still paying for in order to get to the job that you need to pay for the clothes and the car and the house that you leave vacant all day so you can afford to live in it." And I think that a lot of people feel that way, that they're just going through some kind of cycle, day in and day out, merely existing, just watching the clock and passing the time, and maybe having a little bit of pleasure and entertainment here and there to cope with the meaninglessness of it, to distract oneself from thinking too deeply about it. And then there are those who go in search of meaning, oftentimes turning to religion or spirituality. And some people find it there, and some people don't. And even among the ones who seem as if they do, you might wonder if some of them are not just deluding themselves. And I don't mean to suggest that one cannot find meaning in religion or spirituality. However, one of the reasons that many people have abandoned religion is because in their own life experience, religion did not provide them any meaning. Instead, it only provided an empty shell of rituals and beliefs. But ideally, a religion which is properly practiced will guide people to live in such a way that life becomes meaningful. And it is from one's way of living that meaning is derived, not from merely accepting some belief. I remember being witness to a conversation where someone was talking about their religious beliefs, and the other person, who was much more skeptical, asked them, "How can you be so certain? What if it turns out not to be true?" And so they replied, "Well, if it wasn't true, then there would be no meaning to life, and that would just be depressing." And just in saying that, I could see a sort of dark cloud come over them. I could see the change in their facial expression, the look in their eyes, all of which seemed to suggest that underneath their usual cheerful exterior, maybe they were actually feeling depressed, and maybe their religious belief was a way of covering it up, keeping them distracted from it, similar to taking a painkiller or some other drug. But religious belief is only one of many things which a person might turn to in order to try and find relief from the seeming meaninglessness of life. People turn to all sorts of beliefs and behaviors and substances. In fact, it's often been suggested that addiction is rooted in mental and emotional distress, whether that's due to shame or trauma or disillusionment or a sense of existential dread or a sense of meaninglessness, and that we're looking for some way to cope, to take the edge off, or to distract ourselves from that distress. And addiction can take so many different forms. It's not just drugs and alcohol. It can be eating, it can be shopping, it can be gambling, it can be sex, it can be social media, or just being on the internet in general, being on your phone all the time, or playing video games. It can even be in the form of work or exercise, because it's not merely the form in which it takes, but the addictive nature of getting lost in some other experience. Usually something pleasurable or exciting or comforting, or just something that numbs us or keeps our mind occupied in order to escape from some persistent, unpleasant feeling, or in order not to think about the things which give rise to that feeling. And it's probably safe to assume that most of us have some form of addictive behavior, some kind of coping mechanism. And we may not even be aware of it. We might not recognize it as such, unless, of course, we're unable to access it. And then we end up feeling really anxious or agitated, becoming irritable without it. But back to this issue of meaning, the question that always gets asked is, what is the meaning of life? And for as long as anyone knows, people have been asking this question, which seems to suggest that few have found the answer, or that the answers we have found have not been satisfactory to many people. But even when we look to others to find that answer, everyone seems to have a different answer. You can ask 100 different people, and you might get 100 different answers. Either that, or you may find that many people tend to have a very similar answer, which could either mean that that's it, that's the one, or it just means that that's the one that people find the most comfort in. But who's to say if it's actually true? Now, I think the reason why so many people have so many different answers is because there is no intrinsic meaning of life. Because meaning is something that you attribute to some experience or situation. Meaning is how you interpret something, or how you think and feel about it. And a lot of that has to do with what we feel is important, what it is that we value. And so what gives meaning to one person may be different from the next. For one person, what makes life meaningful may be serving others, being helpful to others, giving, sharing, teaching, or healing. For another person, what gives their life meaning may be expressing creativity through painting or music or writing or inventing something. For another person, it may be exploring and discovering. It may be in learning about the world in which we live, learning about nature or physics or biology or psychology or ancient civilizations, looking back at the history of how we got to be where we are today. For some people, it may be in taking care of nature, planting trees and cleaning up rivers, or coming up with new innovative technology to reduce consumption and contamination. For some people, it may be in actualizing your potential, growing as a person, healing, evolving, discovering your hidden gifts and talents, or mastering some skill. So what one person finds meaningful may not be meaningful to you. You have to figure out what you find meaningful. And one way that we can go about this is by asking, what is it that interests you? What is it that you enjoy? Or is there something that you feel passionate about? Is there something that you feel called to do? And a lot of people will say that they're not particularly interested in anything, or they don't feel passionate or excited about anything. But it doesn't have to show up as excitement. It could show up as frustration or anger. Maybe there's something that really bugs you. Maybe there's some problem that you see in the world that you're always thinking about or talking about. And maybe that's a calling from deep within you to attend to it in some way. A lot of people talk about their calling in life, and what that often takes the form of is they're responding to some problem, something that needs to be done, something that needs to be fixed, some void that needs to be filled, some action that needs to be taken, because someone has to do something about it, and maybe that person is you. Now, it may be a good idea, if you're angry, to see if you can transform that anger into something more creative or constructive, although there may be some instances when anger might be appropriate. But what I mean is, just to give an example, suppose that you're angry because you see that so many animals are being mistreated. So what's beneath that anger? Beneath the anger is compassion. You're angry because you feel compassion for the animals. So see if you can engage from that compassion rather than from anger. So that when you're engaging with people who you see as contributing to the problem, the people who you want to persuade, if you can engage from compassion with calmness and clarity, people are much more likely to be receptive. Whereas when you engage from anger, if you're yelling at people, berating them, chastising them, or perhaps insulting them, or just being judgmental, not only are you likely to turn people away, but oftentimes they become more hardened in their opposition. So instead, see if you can appeal to their own compassion. And don't just assume that they don't have any. Assume that they do, and then see if you can draw it out. But whatever it is that you might feel called to do, whatever problem you see that needs to be addressed, see if you can give more focus to the solution than to the problem. But meaning doesn't have to come from doing something extraordinary. It doesn't necessarily have to be in doing something exceptional or remarkable, something on a large scale that's going to get a lot of attention. Even in ordinary life, in the kind of life which often seems uneventful and monotonous, we can find meaning in that by appreciating what we have, by enjoying the simple things in life, by making the best of our situation, whatever that happens to be. Some people find meaning just in taking care of their family and learning to be a better partner and parent by taking care of one another, nurturing and supporting and encouraging one another, passing on wisdom and skills to their children and preparing them for a life out in the world. Some people find meaning in taking care of animals, or tending a garden, or picking up trash around their neighborhood, or volunteering in some way. Some people find meaning in their work, even though it may not be glamorous or lucrative, just in knowing that they're providing something of value, something which others need, something which is beneficial. And whether that's a grocery clerk or a plumber, a cook or a sanitation worker, a delivery driver, a dishwasher, a mechanic, a construction worker. There are so many important tasks that need to be done that make life easier and more pleasant for others. And when you think more in terms of what you're providing for someone else, or for the community or society, it becomes much more meaningful. Some people find meaning just in being kind to others, being a friendly neighbor, asking the cashier or server how their day is going, smiling at a stranger, holding doors for people, just spreading kindness and joy to others. And that's something that people desperately need these days. And here's something else worth mentioning. What you find meaningful in life can change from moment to moment, from situation to situation. It's not always consistent. What you find meaningful in one situation might be very different in another. And so there can be many things which you find meaningful, and it may just depend on the circumstances of that moment. But it isn't just in what you do, but in how you do it. A lot of it really has to do with the attitude with which you approach and engage in life. So that attitude might be one of appreciation, or compassion, or care. It might be an attitude of service, or adventure, an attitude of understanding and thoughtfulness. It's with these kinds of attitudes that we make our lives more meaningful. And here's something else that's gonna sound crazy. But you can find meaning even in suffering. And I'll share with you 2 ways in which I personally find meaning in my own suffering. The first is that I've come to understand suffering as something which arises within me as an indication that I'm resisting some aspect of reality, or I have some attachment or some false belief or some unhealed wound. And so I take that as an opportunity to find out what it is so that I can begin to address it. And as I begin to address it, as I come to resolve that within myself more and more, the suffering decreases. And often what I will discover along with that is some kind of strength or virtue, which I can nurture and allow to blossom. The other way that I find meaning in suffering is that as I tend to my own suffering, as I observe it and come to better understand it, I find that I become more sensitive to the suffering of others, because I notice that others suffer in very much the same way. And the more that I understand my own suffering, the more I understand the suffering of others, and out of that understanding, my empathy increases. And I find myself wanting to help to alleviate the suffering of others, or at least to offer some comfort. And interestingly, as a side effect of giving our energy and attention and care to helping others, our own suffering decreases. I think that what often makes our suffering worse is when we're absorbed in it. So when our attention is on the suffering of others, we're no longer absorbed in our own suffering. And in addition, that compassion that we feel toward them, and especially when we're able to offer some relief or assistance or comfort, that fills us with a very pleasant feeling which alleviates some of our own suffering. So if you want to suffer less in life, attend to the suffering of others. And it really seems to me that a great deal of meaning and fulfillment comes from serving others in some way, whether that's helping those in need, healing the sick, sharing some skill or talent, or teaching, or inspiring and uplifting others, or entertaining others. There's so many ways that we can give. And as the old saying goes, it's in giving that we receive. I think that we find meaning not by seeking meaning, but simply by engaging in a meaningful way.